reliance on the income tax, this strategy is grounded in sound long-term analysis. In short, the strategy is this. When the federal government cuts taxes during a recession, California, at least partially, doesn't follow suit. California did this when California did not follow the feds in allowing for bonus depreciation. Depreciation is an income tax concept. It basically allows businesses to pay less taxes based on the cost of various capital costs, so new machines or new computers. And the idea is if you let companies deduct more of the cost of these capital items, they will spend more and thereby stimulate the economy. So the federal government decided to give a bonus depreciation in order to stimulate the economy during the recession. Now, looked at from by economists, bonus depreciation is a dubious subsidy. Why is it a dubious subsidy? Well, one reason it's a dubious subsidy is that you usually want people to start investing in new capital products right away. If businesses know bonus depreciation is coming down the pipe in the next year or two, businesses will actually delay their capital investment, thereby doing exactly the opposite of what you wanted to achieve. Furthermore, it turns out that bonus depreciation doesn't, at least according to most economic studies, get businesses to invest in things they wouldn't have invested in otherwise. It just gets them to pay less taxes on what they would have done anyway. But it's possible that bonus depreciation does have some effect, but if it does have an effect, the federal bonus depreciation break gets California most of the stimulus bang for the buck, letting California maintain its revenue, which will need in a recession in order to maintain social safety net services. There is room for more strategic thinking like this. For instance, California should think about backing off of subsidizing other dubious federal subsidies, such as the mortgage interest deduction, which, if they have any positive impact at all, are probably delivered by the federal subsidy. This could also be done through increasing the overall limits on itemized deductions. There are other expedients. For instance, the legislature could pass a statute converting all or some itemized deductions into credits that are more available for lower-income people. This shift would only be triggered if, perhaps, the governor declared a fiscal emergency or state unemployment hit a certain number. Post-Prop 26, such a statute would require a 2/3 supermajority, since it would increase taxes on at least some people. But it would also require a 2/3 majority to be undone, because, again, it would be a tax increase on at least some people, which would mean that during relatively good times, we baked a sensible automatic stabilizer into the California revenue system. So that's it. It looks like we're done. States must engage in multidimensional analysis of traditional fiscal policy questions, or they can engage in attempts to game the system, or they can try to do both. Yet I think traditional tax policy, even multidimensional tax policy, leaves out at least one dimension, and that is the design of local fiscal constitutions. States, either through legislation or their much more malleable constitutions, particularly California's constitution, have a lot more sway over local fiscal constitutions than the federal government has over state fiscal constitutions. These local fiscal constitutions can be objectively improved, much like the state sales tax could be objectively improved. It is on such improvements that I wish to focus my remaining time. So here's the slide, right? Non-traditional fiscal policy questions, right? How is it best for a state to design local fiscal constitutions, right? Strategic question, right? How could a state best shift state burdens onto localities, right? We're not going to dwell on that because that's impossible. No state would ever have that kind of relationship with its localities. Right? The key point is that states are to a large extent a residual funder of public goods, but they're in a position to decisively impact the size and nature of this residual. Thus, a well-operating and perhaps even larger local sector could be part of a smaller total state and local government, right? So this isn't necessarily an argument for having more government altogether, but it is an argument for having better operating local government, which could lead to a smaller government overall. The question is, why am I treating the details of the local fiscal constitution as integral to the state fiscal policy? Looked at purely from a fiscal perspective, a plurality of local governments help solve numerous related problems that the central government, the state, would otherwise have. Most obviously, local governments solve a problem in terms of resource allocation. Without school districts and cities, the state would need to have some mechanism for deciding when to re-roof a school or repave a local road. Going back to the 14%, a local government has a better chance of knowing which local expenditure should be undertaken and when and how. And again, it's worth noting the dog that didn't bark here. If we trust that local governments are undertaking local value-enhancing projects, then we may be content when they do not undertake projects. Local governments also solve a funding problem. The state could fund all government expenses through its primary sources of revenue, the sales tax and the income tax. Traditional public finance economics teaches that the distortion caused by a tax increases with the square of the tax rate, and so it would be disproportionately expensive for the state to fund all of its services this way. I realize that that's a mouthful, right? Increases with the square of the tax rate, right? The basic intuition behind this is you think about how you might behave relative to if sales tax went up from 1% to 2%. You're not that likely to start distorting your behavior just because you went up from 1% to 2%. But as you go from 5% to 6% or 10% to 11%, the amount of distorting economic behavior you're willing to undertake in order not to pay that tax increases dramatically. And so increasing a tax from 10% to 11% causes more economic loss than increasing a tax from 1% to 2%, holding everything else equal, right? Which, of course, you might not choose to do, but at least for the moment, let's hold everything else equal. So if local governments have different revenue instruments than the state that they can raise, say, for instance, the property tax, thus keeping all tax rates lower, then holding everything else equal, this is another more efficient way to close the fiscal gap. Right? It's better to raise a tax that is already levied at a low rate than to raise a tax that is levied at a high rate. And what if local governments just had more efficient revenue instruments available relative to those available to the states? Right? What if, for instance, the property tax is generally more efficient than the income tax? And so local governments need to be able to make more efficient resource allocation decisions than the state could. And they need to be able to fund those decisions more efficiently than the state could through its own taxes. Fortunately, the fiscal federalism literature provides a touchstone for achieving these goals. Assign revenue-raising and expenditure powers according to the benefit principle. Here it is. Assign responsibilities and revenue-raising powers in order to match benefit and burden. Local governments provide lots of services, like trash pickup, that can be funded on a fee-for-service basis consistent with the benefit principle. Furthermore, local governments provide local public goods, the value of which tends to be impounded in land. Accordingly, the benefit principle instructs that we should use that land value to finance those goods. The benefit principle helps us achieve efficiencies along several dimensions. For instance, a benefit tax is less distorting because people and businesses are less likely to change their behavior to avoid a tax for which they receive a direct benefit. Again, common intuition here would be higher property taxes for good schools. Right? People will generally willingly pay the higher property taxes if they perceive they're getting good schools for that price. Right? Further, if a voter is paying for a service directly or a tax has direct impact on land values, then voters are more likely to carefully monitor how money is spent. There are three traditional mechanisms for applying the benefit principle. Here is a not particularly beautiful slide, but I'm working on it. Right? So it's a waterfall. Those blue arrows are water. Right. So first, local governments can and should charge individuals fees for services, say for trash pickup or water. This way, individuals receive a price signal as to scarce resources. Second, local governments can and should impose assessments on land for improvements that directly enhance the land's value. It is not just more fair to impose an assessment on a piece of property benefiting, say from a new road, but it's also efficient because we need to know if the real stakeholders truly value that improvement. For most of the last century, assessments have not been very important, but they once were, and I maintain could be again, right? So this is a chart that shows how important traditional assessments were at the end of the 19th century in major American cities, and you can see that in San Francisco, assessments were half of total tax receipts. So there's a lot of potential revenue to be raised if you actually charge landowners directly for projects that benefit them. right? Query whether these numbers have any relevance today. And one response would be to observe the tax increment financing, the kind of financing that was the bread and butter of redevelopment agencies, is also a form of value capture. And redevelopment agencies at some point very recently had redirected up to 12% of property tax revenue towards value-enhancing projects. Now, that number is controversial. I mean, that number itself is not controversial, but whether the redevelopment agencies were really redirecting that property tax properly is extremely controversial, and I'm not suggesting that they were, so much as to indicate that the possible scale of value capture has not been exhausted. That the reborn tax increment financing mechanism or liberalized assessment mechanism could indeed result in a fair amount of revenue. Okay, back to the waterfall. Right, third step, right, there are many local goods and services that we know are impounded into the value of land, say good schools, police protection, fire protection, but as a bundle that cannot be easily disentangled. As to these services, the right revenue mechanism is the local property tax administered by local voters who can express themselves either through voice, so elections at the local level, or through exit, namely leaving a jurisdiction that is charging them too much for services they don't value. In our consumer society, a local sales tax can also be justified to capture local benefits that people receive as consumers. I would say that when thinking about this funding waterfall, that this is a relatively chess-like endeavor, meaning that this is an area where states have considerable power to implement first-best solutions. Once all of these mechanisms are funding all the local projects and services that local voters want, it is appropriate for the state to allocate its resources to pay for non-local public goods, which I would say includes equalization between jurisdictions. But the specific list of state projects is not what is crucial for our purposes today. What is crucial is that the state only needs to use its taxes to fund a much smaller subset of projects than it would otherwise. If this system is operating well, then a state could simultaneously achieve relatively high public goods spending and relatively low state tax rates. Now, California has relatively high state tax rates and at best middling public goods expenditures. And this is, of course, because the local government finance system is broken. Prop 13 has stunted the property tax, and Prop 218 and 26 have hamstrung assessments and fees. Specifically, let me show you a slightly modified slide that I used to teach this material. Oops. Slides are out of order. I'm not sure who was responsible for that, but I'm very upset with them. Right, so if we look at the various options that a local government would have, right, we know that, well, if you want to use the fee for service, that's going to be extremely difficult. You want to impose an assessment, very difficult. Redevelopment, forget it. Property taxes, no way. Some other tax, right, this is the one we're going to come back to, possibly with a two-thirds vote. Two-thirds vote's hard to come by. You could borrow. If it's a capital project, it might be appropriate to borrow, right? Another two-thirds vote. You could evade the two-thirds vote restriction by structuring the borrowing as a lease, but now that lease has to be paid for from your regular operating expenses, thereby jeopardizing your general fund, right? That might not be the option you want to shepherd local governments into, and that's where we are, right? So in California, the local government system, insofar as it's supposed to operate as a filter of projects such that the state funds the remaining projects, right, isn't working very well. Presumably, right, the state is funding projects it needn't fund if only the local government system were working more effectively, and the state is funding its share, its disproportionately large share, through its unusually high tax rates, which, as we know, are unusually distorting because the rates are already high. Right, so that's where we are. Now, I've not come to critique Prop 13 or its progeny, at least not very much. I want instead to discuss a means of moving incrementally to a better system without tinkering with the core property tax protections of Prop 13, which frankly make some sense and anyway are politically inviolable. Or, put in terms of this slide, perhaps we can re-engineer the filter a little. To do this, I want to talk about special taxes in California. Where is that slide? There it is. Special taxes in California. Special taxes are a kind of category introduced by Prop 13 that require a 2/3 supermajority. Special taxes have been subsequently defined by Proposition 218 to mean any tax that is imposed for a specific purpose. And just so you know, school districts can only impose special taxes. So school districts can only increase taxes with a 2/3 vote. Going back to our waterfall slide, a special tax is a kind of benefit levy. It falls somewhere between an assessment and a property tax. That is, a special tax is by design targeted at a particular benefit, and the burden of a special tax can be, and often is, similarly tailored. A special tax can be imposed on only part of a jurisdiction, and it can be modulated according to relevant characteristics of a piece of property, for instance, such as square footage. So if the special tax rules were changed, right, if they were liberalized, that might be a way of at least opening up the filter a little bit. And there are proposals to lower the 2/3 threshold for special taxes. I think these are on track, and the threshold should be lowered. I also think, and I think that special taxes, the threshold should be lower for all local governments, for all projects. I don't think that a 2/3 supermajority rule at the local level makes sense. There are many reasons for this. I kept coming up with more of them. Here are the 5 reasons that the last list that I came up with, right? So here are 5 reasons why supermajority rules for special taxes are suspect and should be considered, should liberalize, right? Special tax revenues are, by definition, directed towards a specific end by the voters, right? So these are not taxes that, the politicians can just spend on anything. Second, the special tax supermajority rule is as to current revenues. If taxes are too high one year, voters can vote out the current city council, and they can lower taxes the next year, right? There's no particular difficulty with doing that if that's truly what the voters want. And if the voters can't wait till the next election, California is relatively unique in that voters can use the local initiative to lower taxes right away directly. So when there's that, so you have 2 avenues of undoing a special tax increase that one doesn't like. Right. Third reason, at the local level, citizens can better express their opinions through voice. Right. It's easier to influence local governments. And at the local level, citizens are better able to leave. It's easier to leave a school district you don't like than it is to leave a state you don't like. Fifth, supermajority requirements enshrine the status quo. Given the current state of local finances, it is not clear why we would want to do that. The local finances, at least especially in connection with the property tax, are rigid, using the sort of dead hand allocation of AB 8 after Prop 13. Again, we can talk about that later. And so the question is why, given the relatively rigid and arbitrary division of property tax revenues that local governments have inherited, you'd want to freeze that system in place. And as an aside, this point goes for all manner of rules that make fiscal systems more rigid. It might be a good idea to make it harder to raise taxes or issue debt. But before you make the system more difficult to change, you should be sure the current system is the system that you want. Otherwise, what you're freezing in place is a system that doesn't work, right? So the ordering matters a lot, right? Don't put a freeze in place when the system's not operating correctly. Taking a step back, the supermajority rule here touches on another chess-like question, which is, in general, what should the decision rules be as to financing mechanisms at the local level? These considerations generally indicate that the presumption should be that local financing decisions should be made by means of an ordinary political process, that is, through local representatives. Not that I do not think there is room for some supplementation of local democracy. Hammering out the details of this is a current project of mine, and lucky for you, I am prepared to share with you my current outline. Right, so these are the different revenue instruments. Then my answer to the question of whether there should be any additional democratic supplement on top of just representative democracy. I then argue for what that additional supplement should be, if there is to be one, and why, and how things are in California. As you'll note, right, shockingly, California does not do what I think it should do, ever. So we're not going to focus on every box on the chart. We'll just talk about local excise taxes, which special taxes are a form of, and the supermajority rule for debt. Now, supporters of the current two-thirds rule for special taxes have at least one very good argument in their favor, as the box there under rationale points out, and that is that special taxes encourage balkanization of the tax base. What do I mean by this? Implicit to the ideal local government system sketched earlier was that there was a standard property tax and sales tax base, and that what localities were doing was deciding on tax rates, not the base. It is another truism of the fiscal federalism literature that it is much less efficient for subnational jurisdictions to compete over tax bases relative to tax rates. This is because it is one thing as a logistical matter to pay the same taxes at different rates in different places, but quite another matter to try to figure out what activities are even taxed between jurisdictions. So it might make sense for cities and school districts to compete over tax rates, but over entirely different tax systems creates so many transaction costs for businesses and individuals that that's generally seen as not a very good idea. Indeed, one of the reasons it could be beneficial for the federal government to have a standard national consumption tax and national sales tax would be that all the states could just supplement it, thereby making things smoother all around. Again, that's not going to happen, but it's just worth noting. So there are no standard bases for special taxes, and this is a problem. But note that the two-thirds rule is just a free-floating obstruction to all special taxes, however designed. If balkanization is the concern, then the answer is for the state to provide a menu of standard taxes, perhaps allowing for exceptions in special cases. One might also be concerned that special taxes are likely to be regressive, and indeed they often are imposed on a flat per parcel basis. But this can be corrected by means of the state income tax. Not only could the state offer generous credits and deductions for special taxes, perhaps only for the ones on its menu, but the state could consider making it easier to pay all local taxes by withholding local taxes along with state income taxes. If done through the withholding system, then these credits and deductions could largely mitigate any regressive impact of special taxes in real time. This is a way for the state to expend relatively little while giving a big boost to local government finances. I have been working on a paper proposing withholding local property taxes and would be happy to discuss it further. As a matter of strategic federalism, it is also important that special taxes be deductible against federal income taxes to the extent possible. Obviously, a state menu that included taxes so designed would be very helpful with this. At the moment, it is not clear if any particular special tax is deductible, leaving the burden on taxpayers and tax preparers. Thus, a reform proposal that simultaneously lowered the two-thirds threshold but mandated the use of a specially designed menu of taxes strikes me as pretty attractive. We have gone rather deep in the weeds in connection with special taxes, and I do not want to lose sight of why. For both better and worse, states must play a multidimensional chess game with the federal government, other states, and their own localities. My sense of the literature is that it is underappreciated how much a state can improve its fiscal situation by attending to the fiscal constitution of its localities. Specifically, I think that local fiscal constitutions are littered with crude rules that do not serve their purpose. As we saw, the two-thirds rule for special taxes does not lead to better taxes, just to fewer local taxes of equally uncertain merit, and perhaps to higher and more distorting state taxes. The same is largely true for the two-thirds rule as to local debt. Local governments are still just as likely to choose an inappropriately aggressive financing structure despite these rules. Indeed, they might well be more likely because it is so hard to get a bond measure passed. Why not lower the threshold and simply limit the available debt structures to safer structures? But what if an entity borrows too much or taxes too much? Here, the crude solution, like the two-thirds rule, is to impose caps. Yet caps can be gamed and are likely to be too high or too low in a given case. Can there be another way? I think there can be. California has already had success with oversight over school district finances. This oversight is provided first by county offices of education, and then in a crisis by the Fiscal Crisis Management Assistance Team, which is largely staffed by former school budget officials. So these are people who are essentially insiders who have the respect of the current school budget officials. And so the FICMAT team, when it comes in a crisis, doesn't come in as sort of as outsiders, and the system has had a fair amount of success. North Carolina provides similar oversight to all of its local governments and has been doing so since the Great Depression, and with very considerable success. Right, so right here's this sort of lot of text on this slide. Right, the first sentence is relatively important. Right, North Carolina, like California, a state hit hard by the recent recession, but because of its local government commission, again, a commission born out of its experience during the Great Depression, and the way it monitors its local governments have weathered the storm dramatically, way better than California local governments. And the state of North Carolina, relatedly, although it's not the only reason, itself has a AAA rating. Right? So this is a nice illustration of this sort of possible symbiosis between state and local financing. I realize there's likely to be resistance to the idea that sensible menus for taxing and borrowing could be designed at the state level, much less that state bureaucrats are capable of efficacious oversight. To such skeptics, I ask, why not? I mean, the current 2/3 rule on borrowing was imposed on localities in the 19th century and predates sophisticated bond markets, federal securities regulation, and the federal income tax. I do not see why we should be so suspicious of our ability to do better. Similarly, if North Carolina can create and staff an excellent oversight entity, I can't see why California cannot, especially one, first, California has already had some success in this area, and two, I bet California can hire away some experienced people from North Carolina. And in any event, such a system should not so much be understood as adding a level of bureaucracy so much as eliminating a bureaucratic miasma. Right now, local decision makers and their consultants are making ad hoc decisions about taxes and debt, with even more ad hoc interface with state and federal bureaucrats and judges. Replacing much of this with a unified system would make the overall system less bureaucratic and opaque. Or so I maintain. I have come not so much to sell you on a particular reform, so much as to draw your attention to a kind of reform that states, even California, can undertake. State fiscal policy is also about the parameters of local fiscal constitutions. And this is an area where objectively better answers are possible. As for these answers, it might be, paradoxically, that the best way to improve local fiscal constitutions is to simultaneously liberalize and constrain them. Thank you. Right, the basic idea is, what are the parameters by which local governments can raise and spend money, right? So the federal government doesn't have much of a fiscal constitution because the federal constitution doesn't say much, says a little bit about taxes and spending, right? People who study state constitutions know that state constitutions, particularly California's constitution, seemingly says only things about taxing and spending, right? How can the state raise money? How can it pass a budget? When can it pass a budget? What could it spend money on? And so and the question is it appropriate, right, for state constitutions to ever get into the details of fiscal matters, right? Why is that in the Constitution versus left to ordinary democracy? But there are good arguments that there are certain basic ground rules about taxes and spending that should be raised to the status of a constitutional rule. State constitutions also often, in California, of course, also contains lots of rules for how localities can raise and spend money. And at this point, there's an extraordinary amount of detail about what localities can do. And so it's not about how they're actually spending money, whether this project is good or that project is good. It's just that if you want to spend on this kind of project with this kind of money, you need to go to a vote and get a 2/3 majority. And here's when you can hold the election, and here's the majority, et cetera, et cetera. So the fiscal constitution are just the sort of decision rules that a government has to go through. You could also think about it as rules that could be, and to some extent also are, let's say, in a city charter. Right? So individual cities might have rules about taxing and spending that the people in the city themselves have arrived at, and those exist. But there are now so many rules in the state constitution that there's not even that much room left for local governments to have their own fiscal constitutions independently of that. Is that helpful? Great. And I have answers to both of them. Right, so as for North Carolina, right, the handout, if you look at the end of the handout, right, there are sources about North Carolina. And specifically, right, whether or not the North Carolina state government has to bail out local entities. The answer is no. The whole success of the Local Government Commission, the reason why the local governments get higher ratings and the state gets higher ratings, is that they have a pretty heavy hand. And they have case studies of municipalities that have gotten into trouble and have been head off at the pass. I mean, they will be told, I mean, they need to get approval from the Local Government Commission, right, before they can borrow. And the Local Government Commission has to approve the structure of their borrowing and their budgets and make sure they have a certain budget reserve. And if it's below a certain amount, they get a nasty grant from the Local Government Commission. And it's preemptive, the kind of thing that you're talking about. Texas's margin tax is based on the size of the entity. I believe it's $10 million in gross receipts. So the idea is that, right, the corporate income tax has this funny structure where, right, only if you're a corporation do you need to pay this 8% tax on your income. And at least at this point, a lot of very large businesses don't do business in the corporate form. And thought through economically, why would you do it that way, right? Why would you only tax certain businesses that might be the same in all other characteristics? And so Texas just uses a flat size breakdown. Exactly. It has a lot of teeth. I mean, it essentially can take over local governments, and I think it can even order local tax increases. So it has a lot of power. Again, I refer you to the handout. I don't know all the details, but the short answer is a lot. I mean, I'm not necessarily advocating, right, a full local government commission type structure so much as illustrating it as a really powerful possibility. I mean, the Fiscal Crisis Management Assessment Team structure and the County Office of Education in California have had a lot of success with school districts without having that same suite of powers as the Local Government Commission in North Carolina. So California could do a city-county FICMAT light with retired city and county officials, and I think that could be pretty efficacious. Great. So I'll start with the second part of the question, right? And so I ended by saying, right, there's a paradox here, and the paradox is that, right, to free local governments, right, maybe you have to constrain them, so that maybe, yes, you can spend money any which way, but not this way, right? You can borrow money, but what you cannot do is use a certain, do a forward synthetic refunding or some other extremely complicated thing that a public official has no business approving because it's too risky, right? So you can borrow to build that school, but you have to use this structure. And if you use this traditional structure, then the financing assumptions are going to be a certain way, and that means you can't get away with essentially a balloon loan type stuff. And so I agree that there's a tension, but I think that it's arguably that the way forward in terms of allowing greater decision-making power is to constrain local governments. Also because, remember, what we want the local citizenry to be deciding is about, the overpass, the basic tax rates. Deciding the structure of debt or the tax base for a special tax, those don't seem like the right question. It doesn't seem like that's subverting local democracy. As for the practical politics of having a commission like this in California, I really hesitate to say, but I would point out that if you think that that public employee unions have put too much fiscal pressure on local governments, and if you also think, and these are all extremely controversial, I'm not sure if I think them, that the local governments are getting into big trouble because of this, and this is also quite possible. It might turn out that there will be legal precedents set in the next few years about municipal bankruptcy and the ability for municipalities to get out of these public employee pension promises. If you accept all those steps, then having a local government commission that preemptively stops, because the local government commission, by the way, also is the gatekeeper for going into municipal bankruptcy in North Carolina. So that might be there might be a possible political compromise here, right? This commission won't let the local government get into such bad trouble that it won't be able to keep its pension promises. Maybe. I think the short answer is that there's a lot, right? I mean, there are a lot of indications that Californians might well approve significantly greater taxes at the local level if they knew they were going to their schools, right? What kind of evidence do I have? Well, the best piece of evidence is that the traditional rule, the 2/3 supermajority rule for borrowing, was changed only for school districts under certain conditions by Prop 39 in 2000 to a 55% threshold. And so what's happened with school district bond financing since 2000 is a kind of a natural experiment, right? How much hunger was there for voters that couldn't quite get over the 66 and 2/3% threshold, but could get over 55%? And the answer is, right, a lot. I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I think between 2000 and 2008, something, 10 to 20 billion, like large numbers of new bond financing was approved that wouldn't have been approved under the old threshold. So, that's one indication. Now you might say, well, that's great. So now what's left to do? You've already lowered the threshold for school districts. Well, first of all, it's not clear why you would only do it for school districts, but also bond financing can only be used for capital projects, which leads to some funny structures, right? So you can build the school, but you can't pay for the teachers to work in the school. So there should be a symmetry between the thresholds for school districts, both for the capital financing and the operating expenses, right? Other indications that there's sort of untapped potential, right, are the enormous number of public school foundations and the amount of money that they raise, right? Those are, they're private institutions operating right outside the public school system, ways for parents to support their local public school because they can't through the regular political process. And right, there's nothing wrong with parents supporting their children necessarily, but presumably, if there was a readier means for them to do so through the public process, they would do so. And so those are two indications. I mean, I don't know of anybody who's actually done a rigorous study as to just how much would be unleashed. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that is, school finance And California is uniquely complicated in lots of ways, but not in the school finance area. I mean, that's something where almost every state has extremely complicated systems, often as a result of a give and take between the legislature and the courts, for precisely this reason in terms of providing equality. And right, the traditional answer would be what, you know, the catchphrase is district power equalization, right? So that might be every school district that promises to tax itself up to a certain tax rate will be guaranteed a certain amount of funding per student. And if you're a poorer school district, you're not going to be able to raise that much money with that tax rate, and then the state comes and helps you. If you're a richer school district, you will. And if you want to fund yourself beyond that, maybe the state just lets you. There are various other structures. I mean, one nice structure in Vermont allows the regular residential property tax base to basically go in, you know, wherever the voters want it. And so there are big disparities based on where residential property tax wealth is located. But the commercial property tax base is a common pool that's used to equalize resources throughout the state. And right, the intuition behind that is, to some extent, well, we all in the state are contributing to making businesses profitable. It seems very strange because you happen to live next to a mall for your school districts to be better funded than my school district when I live just across town and use the same mall, right? So that's the idea of making the commercial property a common pool. But then we want voters to move to the community they want and willingly invest in their schools and pay more in property taxes because they say, well, this is a good investment, right? The school's going to get better. My property value is going to go up more than I paid in taxes. We don't want to lose that dynamic, right? So that's a trade-off. In California, I mean, with the Serrano decisions in the 70s, and that was where California was headed. But the combination of the Serrano decisions and Prop 13 has created a very different world where California doesn't have a system like that. I don't know, right? I mean, there is one sort of celebrated financial analyst who predicted the sort of housing crisis, Meredith Whitney, who's predicted hundreds of municipal bankruptcies, and she predicted that several years ago. Of course, and it hasn't happened, but she said, you know, just wait. And she has some good arguments, right? It's not some of city finances move more slowly. You run down reserves. You raise taxes as high as they can go, and the bill. So it might be a slow-moving tsunami, but I think that with the economy turning around, and especially the housing market turning around, and real estate prices slowly going back up, that I would be surprised if there was an additional wave, a big wave, not like of cities pushed into insolvency. I mean, that's my intuition. If strong precedent comes down that localities can escape pension obligations through declaring bankruptcy, that might, you know, that might change the picture. So. Well, as you can see, right, I mean, at least partially, I like redevelopment agencies. Financing public goods through land value financing just makes sense. Right? If you're building a road that's going to enhance land value, or a sewer line, or some other public amenity, a park, the property around that park that's going to see its values increase should pay a portion of that improvement. I just think that that's sound public finance on multiple levels. And tax increment financing, which is implemented through redevelopment agencies, did that. And so I'm sad to see redevelopment go. On the other hand, after Prop 13 in California, right, the realm of the property tax, right, takes on this sort of Mad Max dystopic structure, right, where there's just a 1%, Prop 13 says the total property tax is 1%. That's it. It can't be higher. And that means that any bit of the property tax base that redevelopment agencies got, they got from somebody else. And right, that leads to two problems with it. Right, I think one problem is that that's not so much land value finance. Right, that's something else. And I think it also probably led to some poor project selection as well. And so, am I sad to see them go in the context of what's happened after Prop 13? I don't know. Would I like there to be a new, better, non-zero sum form of land value finance available for local governments? Yes. Yeah. In terms of whether we're there yet, right, that's hard to say. I think that usually people will say, "Oh, California is a high tax state," and they'll just look at our income tax rates and our sales tax rates. But when you look at our total tax package, and sort of the most rigorous studies of this, I don't have that on my handout, but I'll email it to you. Right, California comes in the middle of the pack. Right, how does that happen? Well, in particular, California's property taxes are so low. Right, so the traditional analysis of economists are, well, lower the income tax and sales tax rates, regardless of whether, or not we've crossed some magic threshold in terms of whether they do more harm than good. Which I actually, I don't think that's true. But still, they're relatively high, and so you could raise as much money with smaller increases to the property tax and create less economic distortion. Right, so you should still do that if you could. And we can't. But what we could do is allow more local governments to impose special taxes, which aren't exactly like special property taxes, but they're a related benefit levy, which has certain additional political protections. And that could be a way, right, to increase local funding for projects and to take some pressure off the state tax base. And so you could arguably have more projects and less economic distortion, right, which would be a neat trick. Great question, and I, at some level, right, I just know what the answer is. But I will make a few distinctions, right, which I think, right. So the state also has a 2/3 rule in terms of borrowing. The state will also come to the voters and say, can we borrow for children's hospitals, genetics projects, these various big projects. The state, when it says that, doesn't have to say how it's going to pay for it. When local governments put a bond measure on the ballot, they do, right? And generally, in traditional sense, right, they're paid for by an increase in property taxes and actually include an estimate. So to that extent, local government borrowing is more constrained and more transparent in terms of costs and benefits than at the state. Now you might say, well, to what extent does a tax rate statement on the bond measure ballot saying your taxes are going to be increased by 0.0623% over blah, blah, blah years in order to, that's another question. But the information is usually there, and furthermore, right, the county treasurer will in fact increase people's property taxes to pay for that project. So it might not be the right project, and the local school board might have borrowed in a very expensive way, but there's at least a dedicated revenue source. Now, a 2/3 majority is hard to come by. So a lot of times what locality, and votes and elections don't happen that often, so often what localities will do is lease finance big capital projects. And lease financings require no election at all and only comes out of the operating budget, right? So in the various crises that are afflicting local governments, right, where their general fund doesn't have enough money, right, it's those lease financings that are really killing them. And right, the irony here might be, well, if only they could have gotten a 55% majority, they might have gone to the people and gotten a dedicated small property tax increase to pay for that thing, rather than use lease financing and burden their general fund. Maybe, right? It's not clear. The sort of deeper question about, which relates to sort of agenda setting and only asking one question about whether you just ask for voters, what do you want to fund this one very good thing, when you don't explain what their other options are. Right, that goes to whether we should have bond elections at all versus just having deliberative democracy and representatives arguing with each other. And right, that's a really good question. I don't have a clear sense of it. I think that Californians are committed to being asked, which is not an unreasonable position. And I think that that to the extent they are asked, the local government approach of showing the costs and the benefits is appropriate. And then I would lower the threshold, but then limit the kind of structures in terms of ways for local governments to get into trouble.